Afternoon, everybody. How you doing? Good. I am so excited to be back on campus. I've been away for a little while, and I'm excited to be part of the panel again. Thank you all for joining us. For any of you who don't know me, and most of you look new to me, my name is Derek Ayala. I am a professor in the Philosophy and Religious Studies department, specifically in philosophy and religious studies. And as usual, I will be your master of ceremonies for this afternoon. However, our fellow panelists, or my fellow panelists, were so gracious to allow me on the panel again for the first time in a while. We'll see if I let them down or not. To begin, I always like to give thanks and gratitude to the various people that make all of this possible. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our new president, Dr. Tiffany Hernandez, and to our acting VPAA, Dr. Lori Konopka. She's still the VPAA? Been away. Okay. Our GCC team has always encouraged the free expression of philosophical discourse on this campus. Understanding is a necessary part of classically liberal education, and we greatly appreciate it. I got to speak with Dr. Hernandez a couple of weeks back, and she was very encouraging for us to continue these events. I was really excited about that. I tried to get her to come out and give us a little introduction, but unfortunately she is away with other business. However, in the spring, we will be having another dialogue panel on animal rights. We'll have an actual formal debate about whether or not animals have rights, and hopefully that she will come out then. And I hope to see all of you, and that mark March 5th in your phone calendars. Special thank you to Connie Greenwell and Lena Ferezzi and the rest of the Student Life team for helping us organize these panels. A special thank you to John Heckenleibel and the marketing team, the media department and facilities. Of course, we could not do any of this without you. And last but certainly not least, a very special thank you to Dr. Susan Campbell and Keely Duffy for their remarkable help with our flyers. I'd also like to thank the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department as well as the Philosophy Club for putting on these events. If you did not know that we had a Philosophy Club, we do. We meet every Friday at 1 o'clock outside of the Language Arts Building. I highly recommend that you come and have a conversation with us. It doesn't usually get too heated, it's not too crazy. We just like engaging in interesting topics such as what does it mean to be human? All right, panelists. Well, to my left, you see our very own Peter Lupu and Richard Claus, both of which have been on these panels multiple times. Professor Claus is an adjunct professor of philosophy in our department. He is also our student engagement staff member. He helps students connect with the resources we have available on campus to reduce the challenges that students may face while going to school, and to help make their time here at GCC much more manageable and enjoyable. Now, considering the care that he has for all of the people around him, especially the students, it's no surprise that in today's conversation he'll be presenting the topic of human dignity. For any of you who don't know, which actually is kind of surprising to me considering how long our esteemed Professor Lupu has been on campus and the enormous presence he has, he is our Philosophy and Religious Studies Department chair. He has been, like I said, a frequent participant in our many panels throughout the years, and he is a gadfly to pretty much every system that he finds himself in. But that's a good thing, I assure you, because he passionately believes in rationality, choice, and doing the right thing. Naturally, he'll be presenting on autonomy, specifically from the Kantian perspective. And finally, there's me. Hello again. In everything I do, I have to be the odd one. As you can tell in the way that I'm dressing, clearly, fashion is not a thing of mine. So not only will I be presenting today on the topic of virtue, but I have to add a twist. If any of you who know me, you know what's coming. I will be presenting from a Confucian perspective. If you don't know who Confucius is, do not worry, you're not alone. Maybe we'll figure it out together. Now, the topic. We're doing some fun things today. What does it mean to be human? Well, we never seem to take the easy ideas, the easy topics, or the easy way out. This is a biggie, something we've been asking since we've had consciousness, I would imagine. There are numerous ways that we can answer this question, And I'd say it's even more interesting now that technology is advancing in the way that it is, from our smartphones to artificial intelligence, and what I can only foresee coming in the very near future, cyborg enhancements. Isn't Elon Musk trying to do a little brain chip thingy or something or other? Yeah, that's going to have a whole interesting set of consequences about what it means to be human if we start going down that road. So, in some deeply profound ways, we seem to be unique among the creatures of the world, not only for our technological advances, but also for our curiosity of abstract ideas, our quest for purpose, and the ability to reflect. So, does being human merely mean that we're born human and our existence is enough? Are we driven to find deeper meaning in our lives? And are we meant to discover a purpose? That's a pretty big conversation, right? Are we supposed to help others? Or are we supposed to live as selfishly as possible? Philosophers throughout the ages have argued every one of these points, and let's see what's most persuasive to you. Final word on the format, or a brief word on our format. We're being a little more casual this time, so each of us will speak for about 10 minutes on our given topic in a less formal way than we've done in the past. And then, if you might have noticed, we have another table set up. It's a little bit of an odd placement, but that's okay. We're going to ask you to join us in the conversation. Normally we have a microphone and people come up and have questions, but we thought this would be a more interesting way to engage with all of you. And so once we're all seated back down, we've given our presentations, we ask a handful of you to come up to the table and engage in the conversation. If you want to ask questions that way, if you want to press on a point that you disagreed with or you want to hear more, feel free. We ask, because of the number, and hopefully we can get some rotation, to keep it about 7 to 10 minutes, and then get up, let somebody else come in. If no one else, then maybe we'll let you stay, and you can come back around. We're not going to say one and done, but there you go. So, without any further ado, I believe that I will let Professor Claus come up and speak. Thank you.
If I close this, we don't need this, do we?
I will need it later.
Oh, you need it? Okay.
I have a vocabulary list. Excuse me.
Well, that's my water.
That's not your water, is it?
This is your water.
How improper of me.
Can I close it, or can I just?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. That way I got room here. Well, good afternoon. Thanks for showing up. I was told 10 to 30 minutes. So what I got done? 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That was a joke. My students are like, no, he can talk for the whole time. We live in a time of cultural controversy. This should not be news to anybody, right? We can think of the fracturedness of our society at all levels, particularly in the political realm. Consider just a few of the cultural hotspots of our moment. I just put together a brief list. Euthanasia, abortion, sexual ethics, transgenderism, reproductive cloning, organ donation, informed consent, rationing of health care, embryonic stem cell treatments, biotechnological human enhancements, transhumanism, like Elon Musk, poverty alleviation policies, affirmative action, prison reform, and the infliction of punishment, and the death penalty, just to name a few of the things that people disagree about. And yet, what I find interesting is that amid all of this controversy, across multiple issues, there is a surprising agreement about the central concept, at least formally, in all of these debates, namely human dignity. You can think, matter of fact, one author has said that there is widespread agreement that people matter. And we can talk about why that is. Matter of fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was put together in 1948 after World War II in light of the atrocities that were committed there. Its preamble says this: whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And it goes on, a bunch of whereas statements. And then Article 1 says this: all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. So numerous cultural conflicts, and yet a lot of people say dignity is at the center of them, even on opposing sides. You can think about euthanasia. People say, you ought not to have physician-assisted suicide. It does something to the dignity of us as human beings. Others would say, well, no, that you ought to have death with dignity. So the concept is there. So I want to probe this concept of human dignity just a little bit. My title is Human Dignity and Why It Matters. And that's a little bit, could have two differing meanings. I could focus on the consequences or implications Or we can focus on the philosophical justification of human dignity, which is what I want to do. So I want to very briefly just examine the concept and definition of human dignity, so at least start the conversation rolling. What are the consequences of denying human dignity? And argue that Christian theism, as a philosophical worldview, better accounts for human dignity than naturalistic materialism. What's the concept of human dignity? What are we talking about? There have been different bioethicists that have said, actually, dignity is a useless concept. We don't need it anymore. Or as Steven Pinker famously said, it's stupid. Human dignity is stupid. And I think this fails to account for the conceptual distinctions in our use of the word dignity. And here I'm going to use the work of Daniel Salmasi. He makes a threefold distinction about what dignity is to help us. First of all, he says there is attributed dignity. Attributed. This is the dignity we attribute to one another based upon certain value systems that we can either have, that can be created. It comes in degrees. It's created by us, and it attributes worth and value to others based upon such things as position or admiration or talent or skills. For example, when we say that extreme poverty creates degrading and undignified living conditions, we're using attributed dignity. Another kind of dignity is, what Salmasi says, is intrinsic dignity. This is the worth or value that people have simply because they are human. It's a value that's not conferred or created by human choices, individual or collective. It's rather discovered. It's something we have because of the kind of being that we are, namely humans. Humans have dignity, Salmasi argues. And he argues for a third sort of conception or understanding, inflorescent dignity. We're not used to that word, inflorescent. Has to do with the excellence of human flourishing. When somebody bears up under extreme suffering, maybe an undignified situation, and they bear up under that, they are manifesting a certain virtue, maybe of courage or endurance. We might say that's a dignified response to suffering. Salmasi would say that's inflorescent dignity. I think intrinsic dignity is the key element, though, that is needed. As a matter of fact, Salmasi argues this is the key element that's needed to ground the other two, to undergird the equality of human rights and universal human value. If we want those things, we're going to need a concept of intrinsic dignity. And intrinsic dignity cannot be a degreed property. You either have it or you don't. If it's degreed, that means some humans have it more than others, and we may end up having, this may be problematic for upholding human rights. As philosopher Francis Beckwith argues, we would have to abandon the idea of human equality and draw the conclusion that no two human beings have the same degree of dignity if it's a degreed property. Degreed property such as tallness, right? Some of you are taller than others, and some of you weigh more than others. Some of us weigh more than you. And so that's a degreed property. Whereas an intrinsic property is not degreed. You either have it or you don't. Intrinsic dignity, I'm arguing, you have it. What are some problematic moves in understanding human dignity? We can deny human dignity. Well, I deny that that's a thing. But I think there are horrible consequences that flow from that. I have my class read first week every year a piece by Dr. Ashley Fernandez, Why Did So Many Doctors Become Nazis? Because I think we see the ideas have consequences and that some bad ideas have victims. My students have seen that someplace. We can also then take a look at, I'm going to skip some stuff here. We can misunderstand the nature of human dignity. We can say, well, it's solely attributed or something else. But we need to recognize it's an intrinsic property, it's not a degreed property. So how do we ground this intrinsic property? How do we explain and justify the needed concept of intrinsic human dignity? Can we just agree and not worry about the philosophical justification? Can we say, hey, everybody's important, let's not worry about it? Matter of fact, this is what happened with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Jacques Maritain, who was one of the drafters and one of the principal people working on that, he was a Catholic theologian, instrumental in that document. Someone expressed astonishment to him that certain champions of violently opposed ideologies had agreed on a list of those rights that they put together in 1948. And Maritain said, yes, they said, we agree about the right, but on the condition that no one asks why, right? We'll agree to this list of human rights, but just don't ask why, because we got different answers that would be conflicting. Gilbert Melander, he says, in a society such as ours, committed as we are to human equality, and we seem to be, at least in principle, or at least in word, we cannot avoid worrying about distinctions and dignity, and we cannot forever avert our gaze from the question of what grounds our commitment to this dignity. As somebody else said, pragmatic foundations are inherently vulnerable. They don't last. They're eventually very weak. I want to argue that naturalism, with its attendant materialism, cannot account for human dignity and value. I'm going to skip some things. But Yuval Noah Harari has recently written in his book Sapiens, there are no such things as rights in biology. He says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men evolved differently, that they are born with certain mutable characteristics, that among these are life and the pursuit of pleasure. And he concludes that the concept of equal rights is nothing but a Christian myth. And Harari is not the only atheist to acknowledge the deep connection between human dignity and its attendant human rights and Christian theism. For example, Luke Ferry has mentioned Christianity as the first universalist ethos. Or Richard Rorty notes that Christianity gave rise to the concept of universal rights derived from the conviction that all human beings are created in the image of God. And the philosopher Francis Beckwith argues, he says, human dignity as an intrinsic, immaterial, non-empirical, non-degreed, and essential property had by human beings by nature doesn't fit within sort of a naturalistic or materialistic ontology or worldview. It doesn't comport well there. As a Christian, I want to argue that Christian theism as a philosophical system provides the needed grounding for human dignity. And here, human dignity finds a coherent home in Christian theism. And there are many themes and concepts from within Christianity that move toward this point. I'll just mention two in particular for our purposes today. Number one, that the Christian theistic worldview states that we are created in the image of God. And this bears and gives value, meaning, and significance to the human person. The other major theme is the love of God displayed in Jesus Christ. You know, Christians usually talk about this person, Jesus the Christ. One of our famous passages we love to talk about and quote is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And it's especially here that Christian philosophers and theologians, and even just people the normal people in the Christian church, as they've meditated upon the self-giving love displayed in the death of Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul writes, but God demonstrates his own love toward us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Gilbert Melander recognizes that in the Greco-Roman tradition into which Christianity was born, there was a concept of human dignity. It was a comparative analysis. As you did the honorable things, you created honor for yourself, and this was dignity. And what Melander recognizes, there was a great rupture in Western culture, a rupture that gradually reshaped the classical notion, the Greco-Roman tradition, of dignity, by bringing it within a system of thought and practice that worshipped as God a crucified man who suffered a criminal's death upon a cross. David Gushee at Ethicist writes, God stopped at nothing to reach out to humanity. God in Christ suffered and bled and died. What more could God do to demonstrate love for the world? Belief in human dignity is deepened considerably by reflection on the ultimate nature of the price God paid at the cross. The incalculably terrible suffering and death of Jesus Christ and the demonstration of that suffering and death of how very much God values each and every human being have contributed profoundly to a Christian moral tradition that exalts the immeasurable worth of the human being. I mentioned a cautionary caveat. My claim is not that Christians, as a people, have lived up to these ideals. You know, we could spend a lot of time on that. Maybe we will. Nor are only that it's only Christians that can be concerned with human dignity. But the key issue is the grounding of human dignity. What we've seen, there's near universal assent to human dignity. I tried to spell that out briefly. So the question becomes, which worldview best explains where does that find a coherent home? Now, historically, we know where that at least has a home, at least by a number of thinkers recognized in the Christian tradition. In the end, I would argue that Jesus is not only the Savior in a religious sense, but he is also the Savior of the philosophical concept of human dignity, for that's where human dignity finds its coherent home. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Are you enjoying yourself? Yes? All right. That's good.
Ask them again after you're done.
Oh. Well, I mean, you know, after Richard, everybody should be feeling elevated. But I'll try to bring you down to the level of our world. So the title of my little talk is No Dignity or Virtue Without Autonomy. That's my thesis. I'm not claiming that dignity is stupid, like, who is that, Pinker? Or that dignity is useless, even in biomedical ethics, or that dignity does not exist. What I'm claiming is that dignity is not a fundamental concept. That's my thesis. It is derivative. It is grounded in autonomy. And I'll say some more about autonomy. Now, Richard did me a favor by already introducing you to the distinction that Daniel P. Solmasi makes between attributive dignity, inflorescent dignity, and inherent dignity. So I'm not going to repeat that. I do, however, want to quote from Solmasi's paper what he says about inherent dignity. Because my claim is that inherent dignity is not fundamental. It is derivative, grounded in autonomy. So let me read you a full passage from Solmasi, what he says about dignity, inherent dignity. Oh, he calls it intrinsic. By intrinsic dignity, he says, I mean that worth, stature, or value that human beings have simply because they are human. Let me repeat this again, because this will be central to my argument. I want you to note that there are two occurrences of the word human here. So I'll repeat it again. By intrinsic dignity, I mean that worth, stature, or value that human beings have simply because they are human. And I continue here. Richard didn't read the rest. Not by virtue of any set of biological, psychological, social, economic, or political conditions, nor of the views of other persons, nor of any particular set of talents, skills, or powers. Intrinsic dignity is the value that human beings have simply by virtue of the fact that they are human. End of quote. So now, I want to raise just a few questions regarding this. This is to me the central thesis. I want to emphasize one fact here, which I will return to, that not in this quote, nor throughout this whole paper that he wrote, and other papers, does he take the step that Richard took here, that the best account of human dignity appeals to some theistic God. Salmani does not make that claim, but he leaves the door open for Richard to just scream in and hang intrinsic dignity on God. And that's what he did, right? Everybody understood that, right? So I'm going to argue that that's untenable. The first question I want to raise about this is the following. First, do all and only human beings feature in intrinsic or inherent dignity? The words intrinsic and inherent are interchangeable here. So Solmasi is not quite explicit about this. He's kind of cagey. So let us suppose for the purpose of this discussion that what he means that all and only humans have inherent dignity or intrinsic dignity. The weaker claim is that all humans have inherent dignity, which leaves open the possibility of maybe other species or whatever might have it. My argument does not fully depend on that, so I'm going to just proceed as if he claims that all and only humans have intrinsic dignity. Now, another question that I want to raise, does the fact that human beings possess intrinsic dignity is a brute fact? Is it a brute fact? According to Solmani, he seems to claim yes. By a brute fact, I mean you can't explain anything further. There's no further explanation, at least according to what he writes, because intrinsic dignity doesn't depend on any other characteristics other than humans. If you remember the quote that I emphasized several times now. So, now if his thesis is that human dignity is a brute fact, I mean that that intrinsic dignity that humans have is a brute fact, then that's a very, very sort of trivial kind of thesis. It's like an arbitrary stipulation. Somebody might come and say, all chickens have intrinsic dignity. And there's nothing more to say. So then those who favor the chickens will argue against those who favor the humans. But how do you choose? Just that this seems to be a totally arbitrary stipulation. Richard offers him a way out, not being an arbitrary stipulation. He situates this thesis within a theistic framework, and he thinks that a theistic framework explains it better than what he calls a naturalistic framework. I want to issue a warning here. If you are interested in these kind of topics, you will often maybe encounter this duality between a theistic worldview and a naturalistic worldview. And then they will say that these are the two options on the table. And then they will say that naturalism is kind of materialism, and that all that exists is material stuff. Do not believe any of it. It's all a simplification in order to allow for the following. Some people use this duality in order to somehow shed a bad light on theism, and others who prefer theism use this duality in order to shed bad light on non-theism. This is a very simplistic distinction, and naturalism very frequently is identified with materialism, but it need not. But I can't go into that in much detail. Maybe we'll have a whole session on that by itself. So, Solmasi seems to suggest that humans have intrinsic dignity is a brute fact. That's it. There's nothing more to say. I, however, disagree. I think that there's more to it. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a distinction made by a philosopher by the name of Anne Elizabeth Warren, I think her name is. In connection with abortion, she distinguishes between genetic human and personhood. Genetic human is all and only those beings that have the human gene. Personhood is a much broader concept, and I'll get to that later. And now I'm going to ask, regarding that quote that I kept repeating, specifically, as follows. Remember, he says, intrinsic dignity is the value that human beings have simply by virtue of the fact that they are human. This last use of human, I will ask, is it means genetic human or person? How we identify the class? If he means genetic human, then he means all and only those who have the human gene have intrinsic dignity. That's the thesis then, if it's genetic human. And I will argue that that way of interpreting his thesis is simply false. And I'm going to give two counterexamples. First, I will argue that the human gene is not a necessary condition for intrinsic dignity. How am I going to do that? Well, let's imagine that we have the display of the video of history of the Earth, let's say going back to anywhere from 100,000 to 40,000 years. During that period, Homo sapiens had a very close relative, Neanderthals. Their genetic makeup was totally different. By the way, apparently, according to what they tell me, the Neanderthals disappeared around 40,000 years ago, were perished. I guess part of it was a war with the Homo sapiens. But let's imagine that the history is different. The Neanderthals survived, flourished alongside with humans, developed science, developed culture, art, and socio-political organization, just like we did. And here we are today. The Homo sapiens developed universities, culture, and all that. And the Neanderthals also did. And sometimes we even interact with them and all that. According to Solomon's thesis, interpreted as genetic human, that genetic human is a necessary condition for intrinsic dignity, the Neanderthals don't have intrinsic dignity. Right? Because they do not have human genes. That's just false. Of course they do. They are no different than us. It's just they have a different genetic makeup. So that thesis is false. I will also argue that human genes are not sufficient for intrinsic dignity. So let's imagine that because of some terrible, terrible effects of environment or whatever, a particular worm developed, and that worm penetrated the brains of half of human population. And now that worm controls the brains of those half of humans, and they are kind of zombies. I do not believe that we would consider these human zombies as having intrinsic dignity. And yet, according to Solmani's thesis, they do. But they don't exhibit anything. They are controlled by a worm. They are zombies. They cannot read, write, appreciate art, develop any complex human society. They don't have intrinsic dignity. Therefore, genetic human, the human genetic makeup is not a sufficient condition for intrinsic dignity. So now, I think that these two examples, counterexamples, totally refute Solmasi's thesis. But why do they refute Solmasi's thesis? Why we think that the Neanderthals have intrinsic dignity and the human zombies don't? Because they do not exhibit certain abilities, characteristics, particularly developing a complex society, science, mathematics, art, self-determination, and self-governance. The human zombies are governed by a worm. They can't self-determine. They can't govern themselves. That's why we don't think that the human zombies have intrinsic dignity because they do not have autonomy. And the reason we think that the Neanderthals, in my story, do have intrinsic dignity is because they do have autonomy. Therefore, autonomy is much more fundamental and basic than intrinsic dignity or dignity in general. Because we make this judgment based on the presence or absence of autonomy. So what is autonomy? Autonomy is a concept that emerged during the Enlightenment. Most likely, I would say, the second most important intellectual development in non-human history. And no, it didn't come from China. What is autonomy? Autonomy is a combination of two concepts, self-determination and self-governance. Self-determination means that a being determines their own identity, who they are. It may be influenced by outside factors, but it's not determined by outside factors. Self-governance means that a being governs themselves, that is, endorses and embraces the laws that would govern one's behavior. That is, they are not subject to some other being's laws. They may embrace those laws and endorse them, but embracing and endorsement is necessary in order to have self-governance. How am I doing? I'm okay still?
About 17 minutes.
Okay.
We accounted for this.
So I had to do that because I have to come after Richard and I have to.
I kept it to under 11.
All right, well, you win on that score. So now, let me give you the big picture very quickly of what this debate is about. This debate is about the influence of the Enlightenment, which had one fundamental overarching idea from which all the others follow. That human beings, rational beings, rational moral agents, are the masters of their fate, their destiny. That our destiny does not depend on some other being, God included. It is this concept that Sulmani and Richards and many others oppose. And the debate about dignity is one of those centers of this debate between the Enlightenment, which offers us the vision that moral agents, moral rational agents, are the masters of their destiny, versus how this destiny depends somehow on a God. That's what this debate is about. Thank you. Oh, you actually need that?
You told me if I was to use Chinese terms, I had to have visual aids.
I meant, dolls and stuff like that. I didn't mean
Right. Thank you for bearing with me for just a second while I make sure this works.
What is going on?
It's got to create my profile since I've never logged into this computer before. So we'll see what happens.
So while he's trying to do this, let me say about something I didn't say. Richard said we are created in God's image and likeness, right? So I have a question. How does he know that Adam and Eve are humans at all? It doesn't say they are humans. It presupposes it. You mean right before that?
Look, I appreciate the question. It's an interesting one. However, I know what's going to happen. You know what? Never mind. I've been up with a new baby. I'm tired. I'll bail out of this one. So I can probably get started a little bit, and then whenever my visual aid pops up, oh, look, here we go. Let's see if we can make this work. That is not what I want. This is what I want. This is what I want. Guess what, guys? There's a vocab quiz. I'm kidding. I just have a lot of vocabulary. Oh, that's not going to work quite the way that I want it to. That's okay. There's Confucius. If you're going to talk about a man, you should probably give him a little credit. Cool. We're not going to go over all of these, but I figured I'd have them just in case. These are the core vocabulary words we're talking about with Confucius. So, I'm going to take a different tack than both of these individuals, and I might, as a general rule, I wasn't going to attack their positions as much as, Professor Lupu decided to do. It's his favorite hobby. But I might lightly say that autonomy and dignity are all well and good, but without other human beings, we're not actually human. This is Confucius's perspective. Now, just to give you a quick background, Confucius is to Asia as Aristotle is to Europe. In fact, one of the most influential of philosophers. He was born after 1,500 years of warfare in what is now China. He looked around at the destruction that had caused and said, we can do better. In fact, he's quite the traditionalist, so traditional, in fact, he goes centuries before him to say things were better in that time frame. You know how people always like, well, it was better in such and such time? He's the ultimate going back to like the very beginning. Then again, I guess Christianity also does the same, but we'll get to that. So we're talking about what does it mean to be human. Both of my colleagues have gone to a fundamental level of what it means to be human, right? What is this sort of isolating factor at the very base of humanity that makes us human, makes us unique? Confucius is actually going to take a different tack. He says, it is only through our relationships, it is only through cultivating ourselves with everyone that we become truly human. Yes, we were born as human beings, but that doesn't mean as much as it could. We have certain obligations inherent to us because of our relational status. Now, contrary to Professor Luper's point, I guess I am just going to attack you a little bit. Confucius is going to point out a couple of obvious things about us. He says that we are social creatures, and we are born into these social communities. We are not born as individuals and then thrust into community. We are born into community and then develop our own individuality from there. My Latino brethren, you know this better than most others. How close are our families? Too close. Good. Why do you say too close? Constantly. Mijo, mija, ¿qué es? Mijo. Like, tell me. Right. So we are thrust into families. All of them have their own quirks. All of them have their own beliefs. All of them have their own viewpoints. All of them have their own experiences. And again, as my Latino brethren know, how much are they going to tell you about all of that? Constantly. You're doing it wrong. What do you mean I'm doing it wrong, Mama? Well, you're doing it wrong because when we did it this way. I should point out I'm only half Mexican, so like a lot of this is derived from others. And it was my father, not my mother. So all of that goes into shaping who we are. We say that we're individuals, and this is a very anti-American kind of thing, right? As to Professor Luper's point, we're individuals, we are master of our own fate. That is quintessential American, quintessential Enlightenment. Confucius says, no. We are part of a unit, we are part of a community that shapes who we think we are, and then it extends outwards. So, because of this, we have certain obligations to each other. For Confucius, his baseline virtue is going to be zhen, or this humanness, this benevolence, this altruism. This is one of those funny words that doesn't translate easily into English. It has a lot of connotation that comes with it that doesn't have a direct equivalency. But it means sort of trying to do what is good for other people because this is good for other people. We see this similarly in Aristotle. And from this zhen concept, he gets the idea of filial piety. One of my instructors at my grad school likes to say filiality because piety has too much involved with Rome, and I mean like the Roman Empire, and then Christianity, and it's not as strong within the Chinese perspective, but we'll go with it because it's the common thing. So filial piety, this sort of loyalty and reverence and respect for your family, is the root of your benevolence. If you can't be good to your family, how much harder is it to be good to other people? This is Confucius' point. So a well-ordered home, a family that cultivates virtue, will have a much easier time extending that virtue out to others. Families that aren't able to do that, well, that causes problems. So this actually puts an interesting and unique burden on parents. You bring a new child into the world, guess what? There's a lot of responsibility that comes with that. You guys all know that, just being there. Again, Latino families, right? We got big families, we got multi-generational families in the same house. So in the baseline, there's a lot of biological stuff, right? You sacrifice your time, your effort, your sleep, in order to make sure that these children survive. But for Confucius, you're actually going a step further. What is the responsibility of parents towards their children? Not only just that they live, but what? So what? Okay. That you grow up to be decent people. In his terms, to not be barbarians, right? How many of you have worked retail or food or just general customer service? Huh? Fantastic. Every single one of you has met parents of barbarians, haven't you? Yeah. In fact, you're thinking 1, 2, 3 examples right off the top of your head. I spent most of my life in retail. I can tell you a few of them come to mind rather quickly. He says this is a social obligation that we have, not just to ourselves and our family, but to others, for this community. One of the goals is sort of social harmony. We have the responsibility to raise our children up to be virtuous. Now, this actually becomes reciprocal because you cannot be virtuous, or let me rephrase it. It is difficult to be virtuous without others. You cannot be human without others. If you're alone in isolation, and some of you taking psychology or criminal justice and stuff, what's what I'm looking for? Severe punishment in prison, they lock you alone. Solitary confinement. What happens to people in solitary confinement? They go crazy, and it doesn't take long, does it? You lose out on something human in that. You lose out in the interaction, and we are not meant to do that. I'm not going to get into the metaphysics of who created us or what created us and that kind of thing. Confucius doesn't bother with that. He says, here we are, and this is what we have to deal with. So we can only be human with each other. We can only be virtuous with each other. And our end goal is the Jinza, so here on the bottom. The superior person traditionally was described as the nobleman. It's a little out of date now. It's a morally excellent person, someone who is able to put benevolence along with the other virtues into practice constantly all the time. Now notice this is a process. So for Confucius, being human is a daily process. You have to get up and you have to choose to do it. Well, I should be careful saying choose to do it. You have to get up and do it every single day for the rest of your life. And at the end of your life, we'll get to see if you were a true human or not. That doesn't seem quite fair, but that's life. Let me see. Anything else that I want to say? I'm going to try and cut this down since our other has gone a little bit abroad. All right. So, yeah, no, I think that's a good portion of it. We can only be, Yeah. That's right. Why this is so important? Because it ripples out. We are not alone. We are not isolated. Anybody taking psychology yet in your classes? Cool. Anybody here kick the dog syndrome? No? A little old school. So the idea is, how many of you have had a bad day at work? Right? How many of you had your boss yell at you? Probably you didn't deserve it. That's true. How does that make you feel? How does that sit with you? Not good, right? It makes you angry, you get upset, especially if you know that they're in the wrong. I mean, maybe they are in the right, but we're not going to tell them that. Right, so kick the dog syndrome is the idea that boss gets angry at you, customer gets angry at you, that sticks with you, you go home, you yell at your significant other, you get angry at them, they're angry now, they get angry at the kid gets angry, kicks the dog. Right, so everything that we do has a sort of ripple effect. So we are born into community and we are obligated to community, and it's only through our cultivation of ourselves, our restraint, our development of virtue, our development of humanness towards each other, of propriety towards each other. It's another thing that he is famous for, is these sort of rituals. On one hand, there are sort of grand ceremony rituals that the state is supposed to enact, but then you have the everyday rituals, so like shaking hands. That is a particular ritual that each of us engage with. And there are rules to shaking hands, or at least sort of social norms to shaking hands. What are two of the rules of shaking hands? Eye contact and strong grip. Good. How strong of a grip?
Don't break anything.
Right. See, it actually has two ways, right? Because you don't want to give bless you. You don't want to give a weak grip. That says a lot about you. But you don't want to try and crush a person's hand either, right? That also says a lot about you. Both of these would be improper. And so you have this sort of middle ground of the virtuous way of behaving. And so we behave in a proper way in any interaction, any context that we have, and this is how we develop our virtue. And through developing our virtue, this is how we develop our humanity, and we become more and more human until we're able to reach this Junza. Now, to be the sage, that's a really important quest, but one that most of us will never get to. Confucius himself said he's not even close to that. The sage is someone that can take benevolence and extend it not just to those around, but to everybody. See, the Junza, what makes them a Junza is that not only are they doing the right thing at any given point, they are helping others to also do the right thing. They are cultivating the virtue of others around them. The sage has the unique ability to do that to anyone and everyone. It's really hard to try and do this for people. How often in our day-to-day actions do people make us mad and upset us? All the time, right? How often do we say things in a snarky way, sarcastically, or just really quickly to sort of zing them back? All the time, right? Later, we often kick ourselves for that. That's not great moral behavior. It's difficult to do this, but it's important to do it because it gives them humanity and gives us humanity. And the more the humanity we give others, the more that we give for ourselves, and then we all grow. So we're looking for the sort of flourishing, as stated earlier, and the social harmony, which comes from doing nice things for nice people or raising up other people as we would like to be raised up. Cool. Yep. I think I'm going to end that there. I'm going to call it good after being without sleep. So begins the process. Anybody who would like to, come join us at our awkward table off on the side to ask questions, to press points, to engage in the conversation. Thank you very much.
I really encourage everybody to consider going to the table. You have mics there, and then you can interact, you can ask questions, you can present your own views and stuff like that. And you need to dare. You need to have the courage. You know, you talked about virtue. Courage is a virtue. So
That is true. You owe it to yourself.
you know how to operate it? There's a switch.
Hello. Yes, there we go. All right, my question is for Peter Lupu. You said that, if I'm interpreting you correctly, it seems like autonomy includes libertarian free will. Would you agree that autonomy includes libertarian free will? And how do you fit libertarian free will inside an atheistic world governed by evolution.
So, what do you mean by libertarian free will?
I mean libertarian free will as contrasted with what's called compatibilist free will or no free will, where libertarian free will would be the idea that when you make a choice, you have, say, 2 or more options in front of you, nothing is determining you to go either left or right. So if you go into the dessert line and you can choose between peach cobbler or a strawberry cheesecake, and you have free will in that moment, nothing is forcing you to choose one or the other. You could choose the peach cobbler, but you also could legitimately choose the strawberry cheesecake, and you were not determined, even you might have been influenced to choose one or the other, but you were not completely determined beforehand to choose one or the other. It's a libertarian free action.
So, would you then agree that formulation of this view would be something like that? A person chose A, but they could have done B.
Yeah, but we have to get the relevant sense of could have done.
Right.
You know?
But it has to be implicit in libertarian free will, some sort of such counterfactual.
Yeah, they had the genuine ability to have chosen B even though they chose A, whereas a compatibilist might say, you know, they were determined to choose A, they were still free because nobody put a gun to the head,
Right.
That's what they wanted to do, but they couldn't have really chosen B. Although a compatibilist could say they could have chosen B in some sense, you know, the option was
Right.
available to their minds or something.
So, I am not, let me put it this way. The concept of autonomy has to do with self-determination and self-governance. From the perspective that I present here, that means that the determination of the self does not depend on or coerced by external forces. Self-governance means that one embraces and endorses certain universal principles and then commits to follow them in their behavior. So, insofar as this is concerned, it could be consistent with libertarian free will, according to this definition. And I'm not very much of a fan of compatibilism. I think that it has severe problems, particularly in trying to distinguish between external and internal causes. I don't think they can make it work.
Could self-determination and self-governance be consistent with compatibilism?
I'm not sure, because according to compatibilism, if somebody has a brain tumor, that all that it does is forces them to act in a certain way consistently, that is, according to compatibilism, free, because it's an internal cause. Yet, I don't think it's free because the person couldn't have done otherwise, and moreover, they may not even endorse in any way any laws which tell them to act in this way, because it's all caused by their tumor.
Real quick, did I miss it? Did we give an explanation of compatibilism for those that may not know?
Yes, so compatibilism is the view that free will exists and determinism is true, that is, every event, including every action, is causally determined by laws and prior conditions. And there is a distinction between internal causes and external causes. Internal, presumably, is somehow internal to the skin or internal to consciousness or whatever it is. But that's where the problem is. Because in distinguishing between internal and external causes, they always get into trouble no matter how they try to define the distinction.
Okay, so it sounds like your view is committed to libertarian free will. My second question, then I'll yield the floor.
In a certain version of it, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, there's more than one version. So my second question is, how do you embed libertarian free will inside an atheistic universe where humans have been created by an evolutionary process?
That's very simple.
Awesome.
Atheism does not entail materialism.
True.
although materialism maybe entails atheism, although there are some authors, or at least I know one, who's very strange, but he's kind of strange anyway. Van in Wagen.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. So, since atheism does not entail materialism, I am free to assume that in the metaphysical sense, there may be abstract objects, maybe the mind is not reducible to the brain. I'm free to choose any of these things because atheism is specific denial of the existence of a deity that keeps engaged in,
Sure, personal ultimate creator,
Yeah.
that kind of.
and in particular, also that our main purpose in life is somehow to be arranging ourselves not for flourishing and improving, but rather for flourishing and improving so that we can have salvation and go to the afterlife and so forth and so on.
Are you saying then that libertarianism is incompatible with materialism? Free will is incompatible with materialism. Would you say that?
I would, in some ways, I would lean towards that view, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. What's your name?
You know me. My name's Gareth. We've met.
Okay, next.
So I just have a question on one principle you discussed, that the clash between genetic human and a personal human. So you do not believe that you need to be a genetic human to experience autonomy, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so and then you use the example of a Neanderthal, which I do not believe is fundamentally that different genetically from a human. They're very close they were very close on the evolutionary tree. They had a lot of similar behavior as humans. Their brain capacity was slightly larger, but like overall they were basically just humans with a different kind of build, similar to like different people from different races were similar.
People are said to have some.
Yeah, I was going to get that. So, and then also, genetically, some people still have Neanderthal DNA, which suggests that if a species is close enough to be able to procreate children with one another, they're basically the same genetically. So, from a genetic standpoint, they're basically the same as a human.
The Neanderthal example that I gave is a good one because they do have different genes genetically. They may be very close, but they're still different. There are some ape species that the difference between us and them is about just 2%. So that's close. And now the question is how close? And I say it doesn't matter. There could be Martians whose genes and DNA is totally different, but as long as they exhibit certain characteristics that presuppose self-determination and self-governance, both of which require, by the way, the operations of reason, I would say they have intrinsic dignity because they have autonomy and self-determination.
And
So
then
the Neanderthal example was just kind of an example that can, it's a little bit different than humans, but so far as I'm concerned, Martians, totally different genes, as long as they exhibit rational agency. And by that I mean autonomy and self-determination. They have intrinsic dignity.
Okay. And then I had another question. It was about whether or not you think artificial intelligence could grow to a point where it exhibits autonomy.
Good question. Artificial intelligence. That's a very good question, and I don't have a set opinion on that. But if artificial intelligence will produce some of the kind of things that we associate with rational agency, then we'll have to. There's a great movie, by the way. What is that called?
Blade Runner?
Huh?
Blade Runner?
No, Blade Runner, yes. Blade Runner. How many of you saw the Blade Runner? Yeah, very few, and simply because it's old. It's older, so you don't watch the good movies.
To be fair, I'm shocked you've seen Blade Runner
Why are you shocked?
because it was like 2,000 years after your time.
Odd.
I know, but I do read
Right.
2,000 years. I mean, that's easy for me. Yeah, Blade Runner, there is a fantastic scene in the end of the movie, by the way, where the last, what they are called in Blade Runner, replicas,
Replicants.
dies, replica, and it says, you have no idea the world that will go with my death, which suggests that they had consciousness, they had a whole range of autonomy, self-determination, and certainly a sense of life and death. And all that world would be gone when they die, even though they were totally different genetics and makeup and all that. So the replicas in Blade Runner were actually autonomous.
Okay. And then I also had a question about like a specific scenario. So say that a robot is, or an AI is created and it shows all the signs of autonomy, you know, it makes personal choice, has its own free will. However, it is run by a code written by a person. So you cannot truly tell if it's just the code itself doing it or if the robot itself as an individual is making those choices. Would you say it's still autonomous?
So this reminds me of Turing's test. Whether we can tell or cannot tell, it's an epistemological problem. It's a problem about our knowledge. The question is, a code, a worm, a tumor, it doesn't matter. In fact, if it determines the action and so forth and so on, then that person is not, that thing is not autonomous. But if it doesn't, if the being is capable for rational processes to uncover, identify, embrace, and endorse universal laws, and then embrace those laws as guidance to their way they behave, then they're autonomous. I don't care who created the code.
Well, that answers all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, Chase, thank you for your questions. And for you coming here.
Am I up? Okay, just on?
A switch in the back.
All right.
Turn it.
It's on, just be close.
Okay, I just had a question about the Confucian virtue. So with that, it's virtuous to act in accordance with your community and your family. So what is sort of the boundary on that? If within that framework, is there a point where it would be virtuous to act against that?
So for Confucius, the most important thing is the filial piety. And so if your family, especially specifically your parents, are acting in a non-virtuous way, or you're supposed to, as he says, remonstrate them 3 times. All right? Tell them, hey, Dad, I don't think this is the best way. You maybe try this other thing. And after 3 times, they still don't change to do the right thing. Then you say no more about it. And then you're supposed to keep his way for 3 years after his death. And if you are able to keep your father's way for 3 years after his death, which in actual terms is 2 years and 2 months, then at least he has not committed the vice of not being a filial father and raising you to be filial. This goes for both parents. So as a general rule,
you would do everything in your power as a filial child. This is one thing I forgot to mention in my speech. Virtue is reciprocal, and being filial is actually reciprocal as well. So your parents raise you to be filial, and then you are supposed to do things that keep your parents filial as well, to try and not do anything to make them unfilial, which is an interesting burden to place on children, but it makes more sense as you get older, right? Don't pick fights with your parents, especially unnecessary ones. It was a very difficult thing for me to learn personally. And so when your parents do things that are not virtuous, you call them out on it 3 times. If they don't change their ways, you say, okay, I will say no more about it. Then you try and act in a way that would keep them from doing unvirtuous things, because that would be a good and filial child. After 3 years, you get to change your ways and be more virtuous.
That's interesting. It's
It
sort
is-
of a, yeah, where you'd have to
So-
permit
Right.
evil to happen just because your parents say so.
Not necessarily evil to happen. Like I said, you try and keep them from being able to do that, right? As you get older and you have more sway on your parents, you can sort of guide them or put them in situations they wouldn't be able to do these things, or you try and make it up to others when your parents aren't around. But you're right, it's very antithetical to the American mindset, right, where individualism is key. The issue for Confucius is family is so important, it is the basis for all other social harmony. If you will not be virtuous with your family, why would you be virtuous with anyone else? And to the worst extent, like if you could go ahead and kill your parents, what wouldn't you be capable of? And so for him, everything is on that bedrock. And if we were to throw that away, then what do we have left as a society, as a community? Everything else goes out the window. And even for us, we kind of intuitively know that, because when you see families that are broken or toxic, there is something viscerally tragic about that, right? Our hearts go out to them, we feel empathetic towards them, hopefully. And you see, in essence, what was lost when that's the case. So it's not ideal, and it's not something that we'd be comfortable with, but for Confucius, the family is so important that you would allow some of these minor things to happen so as not to have greater consequences.
Okay, and I just had a different question about the theistic dignity. So isn't there sort of a weakness with pinning such an important thing as human dignity on something that has the possibility of being false?
Well, that'd be the case with every view, right? If we're going to say that every view is what may be called defeasible, potentially false. So I think we have to look at what are the intellectual resources within the worldview available. And so that's what I'd be attempting to argue. So you'd have to look at all the cumulative case, for theism, not just maybe this one piece. And so I pocketed dignity as a concept that finds a coherent home within Christian theism. But I think we see that historically, the fact that doesn't justify it historically, philosophically, but I do think that's interesting. Out of that tradition, you have this develop. And so I would agree with so much of what both, Derek and Peter have said. I was writing, okay, I agree here, I agree here, I agree here. A few points I'd want to disagree. But we may get into that. But yeah, I think that'd be the same for any view. So you want to follow up with that or press on that? Or?
Well, it just seemed like with the talk, you're having it primarily be on the theism angle, when I think it would be reasonable to try and have as many points that hold up the point of human dignity, because it's that important.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think when I mentioned Jacques Maritain, what he said about the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, as long as you don't ask why, I grant, you don't need to be a Christian, you don't need to be a theist to see human dignity. This is the epistemological question. Can somebody who doesn't believe in God, can they recognize human dignity? I think they can. I think it's a fundamental feature that we're able to recognize. It's sort of almost an intuition. I think Peter used that phrase. We have an intuitive feel for the value of human beings. And so my question is not so much who can see it. I think everybody that sort of opens their eyes to a certain degree can. The issue comes, which worldview, which system of thought best grounds that sort of ontologically, why does it make sense? So my approach usually to these issues, okay, there are fundamental features of reality. This is one of them, human dignity. We can talk about consciousness. We can talk about fundamental moral facts. And so which worldview best makes sense of those realities? And so that's what I was arguing. That's what I was sort of taking this concept that we too intuitively see. And so, I don't know if that makes sense, or or you want to press back, or.
Yeah, I think I'm getting it. That's all the questions I have right now.
All right.
Should I turn the mic off?
All right.
Just leave it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Madison, you going to say
Thank
something?
you, Aiden.
I have a question for all you, because when you were talking about zombies, I had this moment. It really took me out of the lecture, bringing up zombies and saying they don't have any intrinsic value. Doesn't the fact that they were once human and can still move give them some sort of value? As pigs have some sort of value, even if they're not good for eating, they could at least eat the corpse of other things, and that makes it a cleaner world. So I guess the question I have for all of you, all three of you, does this boil down to the difference between worthless and worth less?
I think you just answered your own question. They're now pig food.
What?
The difference between worthless and worth less. Worthless, one word, means you have no value or worth. Worth less, there's a pause between the two, meaning you're not worth as much as something. And does that have anything to do with dignity? So like, no dignity versus not as much dignity in the world. Because we do seem to treat animals and lesser beings with some sort of dignity and respect.
When Peter was bringing up the zombie case, or the humans that got the worm and they had like half the people, in his scenario, my first thought was that these are damaged humans. They will still have intrinsic value, but they have faculties and dispositions that cannot be brought to bear anymore. In the same way, you might have somebody have a genetic deficiency and therefore might be mentally challenged, may not be able to express as much autonomy as somebody else. So that's why I think, I agree that if I'm in a hospital and the doctor's trying to do experimental stuff on me because he thinks that rather than just give me the medicine I need, I'm going to be asserting my autonomy, right? I want autonomy and bioethics. I want that. But I do think it's grounded in human dignity. That's where Peter and I we flip these things. And so I would see those people, those zombies, those creatures, as damaged humans. They have intrinsic dignity, but are not able to have a flourishing life. So I think the categories that psalmistry uses would actually help in that scenario. Now, if you create another scenario, it's like, well, what if we create in some sort of Frankensteinian way, creatures, they're like that are zombie-like and don't have consciousness or whatnot. We'd have to look at what that thing is, But I think if it's a human that simply has damage, I think we want to protect their intrinsic dignity. In the same way, we want to protect the intrinsic dignity of somebody who's mentally challenged, somebody who's comatose, not being able to express that, infants who cannot express their autonomy yet. And so I think that's why I was concerned if it's a degreed property, then somebody has it more than others, which is why, for example, my concern, we went over it very, very quickly, he didn't like genetic human, and he contrasted that with personhood criteria by Mary Ann Warren, in a famous article she wrote on abortion. You read her list of criteria, it is so high that it justifies infanticide. Because she wrote the piece to justify abortion, to say, if you don't meet these criteria, if you don't meet these personhood criteria, then we're not doing anything immoral to cease whatever life this is. It's maybe but she recognized as people pushed back on her, and she had to rewrite the essay, not rewrite it, but she added an addendum. She's like, yes, this would justify infanticide. I think when you have that personhood criteria like that, a degreed property, and you raise it so high, then you're going to exclude people. I think you're going to exclude infants. You're going to exclude potentially comatose patients. You're going to exclude the mentally challenged. And I think those are precisely, it's the weakest members of our society, if we recognize their intrinsic dignity, that we protect. So that was my concern with the personhood criteria. Went over very quickly, but there's some problems with that.
So the distinction between worthless and worth less. Are you using worth here as an instrumental question? Like how much instrumentally certain people can do for?
I'll just say I'm not a philosopher, so a lot of the terms you guys use very casually are lost on me, and I only have, no, seriously, I only have a vague notion of what they mean, so if you could define that, I will answer your question.
Do not feel alone. Do not feel alone by that any instance.
You mean you want for the instrumental question? The instrument.
I will restate my question. Would you say that this argument is if you had to boil it down, is it the difference between worthless or less?
And so my question is whether, like for example, let's say a knife is worthy, can do many things, right? But it's instrumental in terms of the kind of things we can use it for. Will not do well with cutting a tree. So instrumentally, it's then not fitting for cutting tree. You're going to use a chainsaw or something. That's what it means by instrumental. Instrumental is an instrument for something.
Okay.
Now, if the question of worthiness, that you use worthy, worthless, if both are used instrumentally, then I think that both Richard and I will say that, well, these are instrumental categories. We are talking about the categories that are essential. And so Richard thinks that intrinsic dignity is an essential human feature and must be respected. The only problem is that, at least according to this author, it seems to be just an arbitrary stipulation that just humans and all humans with certain, being the category of class of humans, namely having a certain genetic makeup, somehow, as a brute fact of whatever, they have this normative property of being intrinsic dignity. Now, Richard tried to say, well, the reason why that happens is because it was humans who were
Made in the image of his creator, if it is to be quoted.
Mm-hmm. And one question that occurred to me a few days ago is, how does he know that Adam and Eve were human? And moreover, what does it mean in image and likeness, which can, we can spend here the whole afternoon and evening talking about that, because I have a lot of views about that. But the point is that according to the thesis of this author that we both appeal to, it seems like the claim that genetic humans, and only genetic humans have intrinsic dignity, is just an arbitrary stipulation. There's no explanation for it. It's just, that's how it is. Explanation stops right there.
A lot of the laws of humanity, contracts, keeping your words, oath breaking, seem to be arbitrary too. A lot in our nature seems to be that way, but I think it is made that way because
I don't think so.
I think some of it is very arbitrary, and
I
they
don't
do
think
that
so.
because they want to
Not the examples he
have
gave.
a fair treatment, like this idea of fairness and treating others well. There's also another fear that comes with that if you do not give people value and people a worth or some sort of dignity, if you will then have every right to treat that person terribly. And suddenly it becomes a question of scale. Well, if I don't have to treat the person next to me very well, I can treat everyone terribly. And then we might lead to something where there was like a mass shooting where some teenager who read Nietzsche, I can't remember, is it the Columbine shooting? Mm-hmm. Where he says, everyone is garbage, therefore I do not have to let you live, therefore I end your lives. And mine as well.
Would you do us a favor and define how you're using arbitrary? Because I think he might be getting hung up on the usage there. What do you mean?
Isn't arbitrary, like, again, I'm not using a hard definition, so I'm sorry if this is
No,
very
no, no, it's
confusing.
fine. The context is important. So like, what is it contextually to you?
Arbitrary means something that's seemingly without meaning or worth or some sort of grounded logic. Like something seems arbitrary means it seems to be without reason or like hard reason or logic. It just seems to be there just to be there. I don't know if
Okay.
I'm clarifying at all. Let me
Sort of
know.
Random then.
Yes, kind of
Okay.
random.
Not necessarily with reason. Okay.
Yeah, so that's why I gave the example of a chicken. The chicken, those who think that chicken have intrinsic value. By arbitrary, it doesn't actually mean random here.
Okay.
It means it is not based on any a rich explanatory process. So it's stipulated. I stipulate that
Okay.
humans, this class, and only this class with this kind of genetic makeup have intrinsic dignity. Well, somebody else can come with the same kind of attitude and stipulate, that is, I stipulate that chicken, and only chicken have intrinsic dignity, and I also say that's a brute fact that we can't explain any further. And so the two sides then, neither has a good explanation, and neither can say why they are right. They just say, this is how it is. Now, Richard and I, and in some way Derek, gave a deeper explanation. Richard's explanation is, I can give you a better explanation, the best explanation for why humans and only humans have intrinsic dignity. Because they were created by God in the image of God. Okay, I give an alternative one. It's not a mere stipulation. It is that intrinsic dignity is parasitic on a more deeper feature, which is autonomy and self-determination. And Derek would say that dignity emerges from the right way of being brought up and educated to have virtues, in which case you're going to be dignified and you're going to treat others with dignity. That's, I think, his thing. The only problem that he has, Derek, he has many problems, it's just one thing is, many mammals are by their biological code, live in society, in communities. You know, wolves, for example, that doesn't give them necessarily the kind of features that are required in order to be a civilized person, and that feature is reason.
To answer your question from the Confucian perspective, it would be very contextual. Are they harmful? Are they causing chaos? Does the parasite spread through contact with them? If any of those things are the case, then we might have to do what is necessary in that situation to save the larger community. If not, if it's just sort of, they have this zombification for whatever reason and it's not passable to others, they don't harm other people, then we would have to extend our virtue to them to just take care of them as necessary. And then we would give them full burial rights and treat them as members of our family in that regard. They would have all due honor.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for your
Thank you.
questions and comments.
No problem.
And philosophers are not that bad, by the way.
That-
I'm just saying I don't know any of your terms.
That's okay.
But let me just say that this terminology is often very important. For example, if something is wrong with my car and things are banging under the hood, and I take it to the mechanic, I tell them, there's banging under the hood. Now, they open the hood, and two mechanics come over, and they talk to each other. I most likely wouldn't understand half of the words they say, because I don't know their terminology. That means I cannot have even a 2-inch depth of understanding how this thing works. I simply cannot conceptualize it because I don't have the vocabulary. Which is why I keep drilling into my students, most likely 90% futile, how important reading is. Because reading is where you get the vocabulary and you start to see how it's used, and then it expands your mind. The mind can flow everywhere. Yes?
Is it important to just read, or is it also important to discuss?
So the classical definition of actually reading was to read a book and then to have a conversation about it with, actually read a book, write something about it, and then have a conversation with others who have read the same book and have also written about it.
Follow up?
Go ahead.
Is there a reason, or not reason, I'll put that way. Is there an outlet for us as students to do that today?
The Philosophy
What?
Club,
To do what?
to read.
Is there an outlet for students to classically read like that today? And even outside of the philosophy club?
I mean, yeah, according to Peter, you have autonomy to do that.
That should be what your classrooms are. Like
Right.
we give textbooks out and readings for that.
Right. But I mean, in seriousness, right, you find others who are interested in the things that you are interested in, and this is why, like, Philosophy Club is, like, the starting point that we would argue for, and to Richard's point, classrooms, right? And then you say, like, hey, this is an interesting idea. Do you want to read this with me? And then, you know, go through it chapter by chapter or whatever, whatever your attention span allows for. I can attest to having very minimal of that. And then find others to have the conversation with with each other. We're coming up on really nice weather. And so as you're outside, sitting under the trees, eating lunch or whatever, it's a great time to do it. One of the coolest things I found when I was at my grad school at St. John's in Santa Fe is that, and granted, they're a weird type of person that goes to that school, and so they're already inclined towards that. Like, I attest to that as well. That's what they would do. They would just all get together and hang out and have conversations about whatever it was that they were specifically reading. There was Dante or Kant or Plato or you know, Descartes' geometry. So I would say talk to people on campus. We up here constantly are encouraging that. Put the phone down and go talk to people, because that's the cool part of the college experience, is getting to know new people, getting to have conversations with others about the things that you are interested in and that they're interested in and everything else. So yeah.
The library sponsors every semester a book they're reading with discussion groups, and multiple times they meet. You know, and they're usually, you know, fiction books, but you know, there's some great themes that come up out of those books. They choose them for that reason, so discuss. So that's also another avenue. I'll just share this story. You know, when I was dating the person that would become my wife, you know, I figured, I knew she loved me because I said, why don't we read some books? So she was a reader and I was a reader, and so we read, you know, we read Dante's Inferno together, and I said, hey, I want us to read Plato's Euthyphro. And so I knew she loved me because she did that. Because she read it. She says, she came with her underlines and was talking with me about it. You know, I'm like, okay,
That's beautiful.
this is the one. So,
I mean, the other thing too is, you know, when your professor's on campus and have office hours, go ask them about it, especially if it's in either literature or philosophy or whatever else. Say like, hey, I was reading this was confusing, or I really disagree with this, or can you explain more about this? That's what they're there for. Oh. I'm sorry,
By the
we're...
way, before Matisse, hi. Matisse, he is a very French name. I want to just make a comment to your previous comments. What's your name again?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm Madison. Hi.
Madison?
Yes.
Hi, Madison.
Hi.
Because Derek, being very virtuous, did the correct thing and shut me up when I tried to say something while you were talking. The examples that you gave, I don't think are arbitrary, like the examples of telling the truth or being honest and all that. They're not arbitrary. They're not simply conventions that we adopt in order for us to, you know, live together or whatever. Lying is an act that undermines a presupposition of all communication. Because all communication between us is based on the assumption of trust. That when I ask you the question, what is the time, you're not going to tell me, oh, it's 1 o'clock, 1 a.m.
2:43.
You see? So if you say lying is just okay whenever you want it, then eventually all communication breaks down. So what I'm trying to say is that truth-telling is a presupposition of all communication. And if you look at big social structures, you will see how systematic lying created a distrust, which then creates other serious social problems. And that is the political arena. When little lies after greater lies created a situation in which today, in this country, people don't trust politicians. And therefore, the political system cannot operate. You cannot have a democracy without a sense of truth. So these are not arbitrary, they are norms we adopt because they have a huge role in maintaining many important social structures.
When I said arbitrary restrictions, I was actually meaning like philosophers talking and giving arbitrary restrictions so that they could either illustrate a point or to finally state an idea, theory, or concept. That's what I originally meant. That's the way I was trying to point. I just never quite got there. That's what I meant.
So the thing is, what I just told you is exactly part of what the philosopher Immanuel Kant proposed. Okay? And specifically about lying. His example was lying. But for example, if you have fraud, let's say commercial fraud, what happens? Well, the whole system, the whole commercial system is undermined if there is too much fraud, because then people will not trust the commercial systems, and so forth and so on. Matisse.
So I have a few questions about just dignity overall. First, I was curious on each of your views about, since dignity is an intrinsic value that all humans have, could it in a way be lessened or removed based on the actions of that person, or maybe the views they have, or throughout some other means? Like, can dignity be taken away from someone, or does everybody have it forever?
I think that's where Salmasi is trying to parse out that by saying that the dignity that cannot be lost is intrinsic dignity. No matter what you do, you have that.
So would you argue, even if someone is a war criminal, they still have a sense of dignity intrinsically?
Yes, because they're human. What they've failed to live up to are moral standards, and so in that sense, when we call attributed dignity, and inflorescent dignity, they're not living the flourishing life because they're not living in accordance with the ultimate good, and so we would say, and they're violating that. So the fact that they have intrinsic dignity doesn't as a human being actually hold them, I think, more responsible for their moral life. And so it doesn't mean, oh, you get a pass, but we do talk about those people that they act like animals. We maybe use that metaphor with behavior. And I think at that point, they're acting against their intrinsic dignity, but they're still human. I think to be human is to have that. That's the element that they have. But not that the other things aren't important. And so it's precisely because they're that the moral choices they make have such a significance.
So you mentioned there's attributed dignity as well as intrinsic.
Mm-hmm.
And since attributed is like moral codes and standards, would it be safe to say those can be lost or taken away based on someone's actions? Or is all dignity forever?
Well, I think that person is acting in that sense, in the attributed sense, that they're acting in an undignified way, because they're acting against the moral law.
But that doesn't take it away.
I think what Salmasi is trying to do with his distinction is to recognize we do make these kinds of distinctions, and we a lot of times we put them under this one word, and sometimes there can be equivocation going on. with how we use a word, right? So it seems like we're using it one way here and one way here. And so what he's doing as a philosopher, trying to make, well, I wonder if there's distinctions with what we mean. So when we try, and so he even says, if you want to lose the word dignity completely, you'll still have to come up with new words to sort of correspond to these concepts. So if you want to say, okay, I want dignity only to go to attributed dignity, so if you act like an animal, then you're acting in an undignified way, you know. And we use that language, right? If somebody's all of a sudden defecating in the corner here, it's like, that was very undignified, not a very dignified thing to do, you know. We'd all be like, that's gross as well. And we use that language. So if we want to use the language of dignity only for, let's say, intrinsic dignity, that inherent dignity that everybody has, and we don't want to use it for other things because it gets too confusing philosophically, Salmali says, you're still going to have to create some other word to talk about that concept that we sort of all know. It's like, yeah, that you did not live in accordance with what you were supposed to do. And so in that sense, you were whatever word you want to come up with in that moment. So I don't know if that makes sense. That's why he's trying to parse this out, because I think these are fundamental realities that are out there that we recognize, but you seem to they get all under the umbrella term of dignity. So he says, what he tries to do, if I can parse that out a little bit, here's what I'm talking about, why it is in one sense, you know, you cannot lose dignity, and in another sense, you acted in an undignified way. You've somehow lost dignity. Or a person that doesn't develop themselves to all that they could be in terms of maybe certain virtues, you know, because that's where I would definitely, a lot of what Derek said, I would agree with, you know, in terms of, you know, that there's virtue ethic. If you fail to live up to that, you've not lived up to the dignity. You've not lived up to dignity. You're failing. You're less with your dignity in that regard. Whereas somebody that responds to maybe a suffering with great courage, nobility, you know, whatever the circumstances that you would find admirable, you say, well, that was a moral hero. That was a hero of, or she was a hero of endurance under pain with such dignity, right? But versus somebody else who didn't. So there's a gradation there. And so I want to try to keep what protects, you know, what I think we intuitively feel about what the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights are trying to get at, to protect that. Their version of what they're talking about, human dignity, you know, that's grounded in the intrinsic or inherent dignity of the person that can't be lost. I don't know if that helps, why he's moving the way he's moving with the...
Yeah, so it sounds like the way you're describing it, dignity is like on a spectrum. So there's people that have low amounts of it and then people that have more of it. Is that
not
correct?
Intrinsically, right? So it depends, again, what you're talking about. The
Yes,
others...
attributed dignity would be...
Yeah, I think
varying
there's
degrees.
gradations there, and there's gradations in fluorescent, because we recognize some people live a flourishing life, manifesting virtues that are in accordance with that which is good, and those that don't. And we can, and some that actively live their lives against that good, and we'd say that's profoundly, so in that sense, yeah, so one is not a degreed property, you have it because you're virtue of a human, and the other can be degrees.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I have a question in light of Matisse's questions and others to Richard. Imagine that somebody says the following: X is a human being. And say X has intrinsic dignity. Did the second proposition add to the first one? Anything?
X is a human being.
X is a human being. X has intrinsic dignity. Does the second proposition added anything at least according to Somani? Sulmasi, is it? Sulmasi.
Somasi, yeah.
This-
Ontologically, no, I don't, but I'm wondering, you know, conceptually, helping us to understand, or, you know, picking out maybe properties or elements of the human person.
Because you see, it seems to me, it's like again, as I said, it's an arbitrary stipulation. What do you add?
For those who don't know, ontologically means the nature of being, so in and of itself.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
It doesn't add even at that level. It just doesn't add anything. Ontologically, metaphysically, the nature of being. Water is H2O. These are facts out there. Nothing can be water unless it's H2O. Okay, but there's huge rich explanatory story behind that. This is part of of a whole chemical theory. It explains the nature and behavior of water, particularly why it boils and why it does this and why it does that.
Well, you're not saying, unless you can give a scientific explanation for something, therefore you can't explain something, right?
You don't explain anything.
I think
It's
you,
like saying
I think you
X
create,
is P, X is F. What does F add? Nothing, it's just B, P.
I
That's
think-
it.
I think
It's like,
we can-
What does, X has intrinsic dignity.
Are we talking about the if, therefore, if then statements?
What I want to know is, according to this author, which Richard accepts, he thinks that there is something very deep in the claim that human beings have intrinsic dignity. And I say, here is what this claim amounts to. Human being have intrinsic dignity, amounts to human beings are human beings. That's it. It doesn't say anything more than a trivial claim that human beings are human beings. That's it. Tell me what kind of property dignity is that intrinsic dignity that attaches to a class of beings that gives any purchase on any explanation, any useful thing beyond just the claim, this class of being has intrinsic dignity. Full stop.
well, you remember the paragraph before the one you quoted. Dignity is fundamentally a value term. All uses of the word refer to the worth, stature, or values. So we're talking about there's some value inherent in being a human being. And I think we intuitively grasp that. And so we have to ask, okay, what grounds that? And you say you wanted to argue, well, it's autonomy in appealing to Marianne Warren's personal criteria. I'm like, well, that's a degreed property, which means we won't be able to properly value infants, comatose patients, those that can't express that autonomy yet. And so that's the danger, I think, if you reverse those. That's why I think it's important. So we recognize that there's a value to the human person.
Fair enough.
Okay.
That is a critique of my position. By the way, this position is not the same as Warren. I just used her distinction in order to clarify or give a little bit more content to the claim human beings have, and only human beings have intrinsic dignity because they are human. So what is the because? The because is supposed to be explaining something. Because they have genetic makeup, or because they are persons. I claim it's because they are persons, and by persons I mean autonomy. I know I'm not committed to her list.
Okay. But you brought that up, so that's what I was going to.
But I grant that my position is vulnerable to those two classes of humans that you're talking about.
Right.
And I openly embrace the challenge. You know why? Because that shows that my theory has explanatory power. Because it has exceptions or apparent exceptions that it needs to explain. Whether your theory is saying, well, human beings have intrinsic dignity means the same as human beings are human beings, and of course infants, to the extent that they are human beings, they are also human beings. It doesn't give you any explanatory purchase on anything.
I think what I'm pocketing it in a worldview where there's a personal God, which I know we're going to have some differences there, which I think makes more sense that we're actually in a transcendent relational value. So I think the relational values that came out in Confucianism are reflection in the created order of a transcendent. And I think the image of God is a category that it fits well within. And I would simply argue that I know I didn't specify what that image was, but there's a lot of debate about that. But at least three different things can be found, I think, in the text. Some people talk about a resemblance that we have to God, and they usually pick out a feature. If you look at different people in the history of the church, or the history of Christendom and Christian philosophy, there's some sort of resemblance feature. Well, we have maybe rationality, or we have autonomy, or we have the ability to love. And so we might call that this a structural issue. We're sort of like God because we have a capacity that He has. There's also the representative capacity when in Genesis 1 where it talks about you shall have dominion. So we're supposed to.
Richard, just one comment, just a
Sure.
very literal biblical comment.
Yeah.
The he bothers me there because it actually says in our
Right,
image
okay,
and likeness.
okay, fair enough.
And the hour suggests a plurality, which of course is inconsistent with monotheism, right?
No, no.
So the hour must suggest that it's not a he, or it's not a she, or it's not a it, it's an hour.
He mentions in our
But
image,
that is just
as soon as the text goes on, it uses the singular though. So that there's a
Yeah, but
singular,
it-
there's a singular that creates.
Let us create
Yep. Yeah, we can talk about that,
in
you know.
our image and likeness.
Right.
Now, to me, that means if you want to say that there is a message in these scriptural words,
Mhm.
passages, then we have to be attending to that.
We do, and I think we would have to look at, you know, the issues of how that is used and how that's fleshed out in the rest of the Tanakh. You know, the Hebrew scriptures, as well as, then I would argue, the Christian scriptures. And so,
Yeah, so I
we
think
can talk about that, but let me finish this point, you know, in terms of
Yeah, go ahead.
the resemblance.
In
the
what
rep-
respect, by the way?
In some sense, I think capacities we have are a reflection, our ability to reason, our ability to love, you know, these are capacities that are,
Prior to that passage, there is no mention of reason about God and love about God. There's only one thing that comes before that passage. Only one thing from which we can tell anything about God. God is a law creator. God creates the laws that order chaos. God creates the laws that distinguish darkness from light. God, all we know prior to that is God creates laws. So if we were to ask what image and likeness means, at that point, all we know is God is a law creator, which means we resemble God insofar as we are law creators, namely autonomous.
the third one, just to make, the relational element, he makes them male and female, so there's a relational element. So I think all those, we have to be in some sense like God so that we can actually represent him in the world and have our ultimate, goal is to be found in relationality, ultimately with each other, with each other and ultimately with God himself, There's a lot of questions there you asked. It'd be fun to probe into.
By the way, also the creation, this touches upon some very sensitive issues. So it says God creates, what is the phrase? God creates them man and woman. God creates them man and woman, right? But that's funny because there are two interpretations of that. One creates each, having the property of both man and woman. So each of them has the properties of being a man and also the property of being a woman. Or God creates them, namely one as a man and the other one as a woman. Now the second interpretation, of course, is the traditional one that is viciously against transgender stuff. Whereas the first one is a much more interesting one, whereby it creates each with some characteristics of male and some characteristics of female.
And that's fascinating. What you want to do when you get two models, like two interpretations like that, you want to take it, okay, let me look at the text in its fullness and not just pull out a phrase, because pull out a phrase without a context, you get messed up. So which one of those models, those interpretations, would mesh and fit? This is almost like what scientists do as well. I've got a model, which one fits best with the data set in front of me? Your data set here is the scriptures, the Tanakh. You can either say it's the book of Genesis by itself, you can say it's the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, or the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew scriptures in total. You can go beyond that if you want. So which model fits? So you can create all sorts of crazy stories or interpretations. I'm not saying this is necessarily a crazy interpretation, but there are ways to adjudicate that. I'm not a hermeneutical relativist. Every interpretation is just as valid as the other one. How would we do that? Well, we look at the data set. Does this interpretation make the best sense of everything in front of us in the text?
And where does that view lead? Look at what it led to.
Hold
There are
on.
thousands of different interpretations that are accepted by different movements within about the same book, looking at it in a holistic way.
Look, I know.
And they disagree, and sometimes those things lead to lots of wars.
Well, sure, that's true. That does nothing to disprove what I just said, though, as a methodological point.
All right, hold on, both of you. I know you guys have been aching for this battle for a long time, and sometimes it comes out in the club. If you want next fall, we'll just have the battle royale between the two of you, and we'll see what the hell happens. I think it'd be interesting, maybe one of the biggest draws.
Next fall, I want to talk about the naturalist thing.
Oh, okay. Well, that might actually come out in this. Any further questions on that, or any more
I
clarification?
think that he wants to ask another question.
But Matisse was there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, since we're on the topic of God and religion, I was just curious.
Just gonna throw gasoline on that, aren't you? Okay.
Mr. Claus, you were talking earlier about how, is it safe to say you were saying that dignity is instilled into all humans by God? God gives us our dignity when he creates us?
Yes, yeah, I think I can go with that, in terms of
Okay.
that.
So,
To be made in his image is to have dignity and a value because of that, yes.
and therefore, would humans have dignity if there was no God? Or if they didn't believe there was a God?
I think if there was no God, there would be nothing, right? From the Christian perspective, right?
There's debates on that.
Right. Well, no, I think, in terms of, at least from the Christian worldview, that God's a necessary being. And so, it's hard for me to make sense of the question. If there was no God, would I still have dignity? I wouldn't be here. Since he's
let's
upholder,
look
the
at
creator and upholder of all things.
Theory of evolution, okay?
Sure.
So, with this theory, there is no God, humans...
Well, no, that's not true,
Okay?
right? The theory of evolution is talking about differential change in the genome over time because of being acted on by natural selection. Now, and what people do, and this is what happens in our popular culture, they'll say, well, because we see that, and we can maybe see parts of that empirically, therefore that justifies me to make a metaphysical claim, there is no God. Now, Darwin himself made that move. He was a naturalist. He was a naturalist before he began to formulate the theory. If you look at his notebooks and his private letters. So we know that. So he made that metaphysical commitment before the science. The co-discoverer, Alfred Russel Wallace, did not believe that. He said there is a teleology. He had a version of a God. I don't think it was necessarily maybe like my version of God, but he had sort of this teleological element. So be very careful about saying moving so quickly from evolution. We have to specify, because if embedded in your definition of evolution is by definition there is no God, that's a metaphysical philosophical claim, not a scientific claim that needs to be justified. So again, I want to parse those out. So you want to start again?
Yes, so it's my understanding of the theory of evolution is that everything just kind of happened by chance. Things evolved, life evolved, and everything eventually developed to the point where it is now. And that could have included the hand of a God, it could have not included it. But let's assume it didn't include any push or involvement by God, then would we still have dignity if that was the case?
I don't see, again, from the Christian worldview, I don't think that makes any sense to even ask that. I think God has to be there necessarily. I think he's, ultimately explains so many other things like consciousness, our human value, human morality. And so I think a Christian ought not to answer that question because it doesn't make sense from within our worldview.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think that you have to be careful. We repeated it several times, Richard, that God has to be there necessarily. If God exists, then God has the property of necessarily existing. That's an if-then statement, as she pointed out earlier. Are we talking here about if-then statements? Yes. So in order to prove that God necessarily exists, you have to first prove that God exists, right? Now, now that will be true even if God doesn't exist. It's still going to be true that if God exists, then God necessarily exists.
Right.
That will be still true even if the antecedent God exists is false. So he says, assuming that proposition is true, but assume the antecedent is false, would, at least according to Salmasi, at least he's neutral on this, still human beings will have intrinsic dignity, right?
Yeah, I don't know how he'd answer that. I don't know what he'd do with that.
But so far as we both read the paper, this paper, he doesn't offer the additional step that
Right,
you do.
right. No,
Okay, so according to him at least, it's at least possible that humans have intrinsic dignity even if God doesn't exist. Now, the question, therefore, that puts a burden on you to say, in what way is it necessarily the case that the intrinsic dignity attached to the class and only human beings depends on God? Because even assume God created us, why then it follows that intrinsic dignity, if it exists for every member of the class, does depend on God? Where is you get that step? And I think that was Matthias's question.
Again, I think I'd come back to it. It's precisely because he created the origin of. I think you're maybe getting this question. I do think the origin of us, humanity, has a place to play in how we're going to understand this question. So if it is simply we're burped up in a sea of chance by non-teleological processes, by that meaning no purpose, no prevision, that we're just sort of this accidental collocation of atoms or molecules, as Bertrand Russell says, then I think that's going to affect the way you understand the notion of human dignity. I think that's why you get people that say they try to be as consistent as they can with that naturalistic perspective. So you got like a Lawrence Krauss at ASU who says we're just bits of pollution, cosmically speaking.
Richard, that's not Matisse's point.
Okay, what's?
You
Can I
try to
rephrase my
reduce
question?
His
Yep.
question all the time to this naturalism versus non-naturalism.
No.
His question is this. He just gave an example of evolution to highlight the question.
Sure.
He says, assume that God created us. Assume, again, so that all and only human beings have dignity. Now you have to ask, why is it that because we were created by God, does it follow that we have intrinsic dignity? Because, for example, presumably, according to your picture, ants were created by God.
But not in the image of God. There's
so
something.
Everything depends then on image and likeness, right? That's your answer. You see, the answer that Richard gives you is the explanation why being created by God bestows upon this group of beings intrinsic dignity is because of the image and likeness, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that's
yeah.
that's an answer to your question, and there is no similar answer in the evolutionary theory, which is where.
Yeah, and that's I thought you were starting out. If you were going someplace else or different, I'm sorry. I thought
No, you're all right. Let me kind of rephrase it and just ask a more direct question. If there was no God, would humans still have dignity?
I don't think there'd be humans.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, so you see, I thought that your question was putting a little bit more of pressure on him and to explain why being created by God, assuming that that story is true, does it follow that these and only these beings have intrinsic dignity? So
Well, that was a good point because I had a third question that kind of follows up along with that, first I want to ask, is it agreed that God also created the animals around us, like the cows and the chickens and the sheep?
I would argue, yeah, he's the creator of all things. And I'm not specifying the process, but yeah.
Yes, they were created. So then why do those animals not have the same intrinsic value that humans
image
do?
and likeness.
Image and likeness. I think.
That's it.
I think there's value. I think there's value to created entities, and and Psalmist actually mentions this as well. He says that there's a gradation of values there, but I think what the Genesis story teaches, however you interpret it, that there is a culminating aspect in the text with humanity, because he creates everything first, moving from smaller to greater things, and the greatest thing is that when he wants to make something as near as him as possible, he creates humanity in his image, male and female, and it gives them dominion, representational over the earth, and they're to live in that relationality. So I think all of that, and that becomes part of the foundation of sort of the biblical narrative, which is a backbone of the Christian worldview.
But you see, the central point here, which is I think fundamental, is there is a lot of debate about image and likeness, as you know, and generally speaking, I think most of the sane participants in this debate say image and likeness can't be physical. It's not a physical, two eyes and eyebrows and all that. So once we rule that out, then the resemblance relationship has to be understood in more abstract terms. Can't just be that God, that because we have two eyes, then the resemblance is God has two eyes.
Right, that's why I specified those three things. So you got different people that will focus on the representational aspect. The image is actually how we represent him to the world, how we steward this planet. Others say no, the key element is the relationality element, that we're made to be in relationship. And I was thinking all three of those go together. You cannot engage in the kind of relationality that the Genesis text presupposes and the rest of the scriptures presuppose without certain structural capabilities, that are inherent in the human person, that we have, in sort of inherently that become we manifest over time, such as the ability.
Richard, do you know what the problem with that is?
You're going to tell me.
Yes, I will tell you.
Gentlemen.
All of this together with the Adam and Eve story is about 2-3 pages. It's very concise. And then come hundreds of pages that show how much of the kind of structural system you presuppose is actually goes wrong all the time. That is how difficult it is. The whole Old Testament, after those few pages, is about how difficult it is to fulfill this image and likeness relationship.
Yes, exactly.
How
Which is why
difficult it is.
I had my second point, which you've not touched, which was we need Jesus, right?
Yeah, maybe we need Jesus, and maybe we need even more than that
Yeah.
in order to live up to
Gentlemen.
that. But
Does
go ahead.
that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you.
If anyone else wants to speak, I've already spoken, so I'll be happy to yield if anyone else has a question. Going once, going twice. Okay, so my question's for Derek Ayala, and we're going to bypass Richard and Peter for a while. Okay, so I'm curious, in the Confucian tradition, does Confucius, or does anyone in the tradition, believe in inherent dignity, and do they think that you can lose your dignity? And if you lose your dignity, is there a path of redemption? I'm contrasting this with the Christian tradition where, putting Professor Klaus's point aside, that you can never lose your intrinsic dignity, there's another view that the dignity of humans is zero after the fall, but you can be redeemed. You can be, and I'm wondering if in Confucianism, can the dignity be zero, but somehow you can be redeemed in a Confucius system?
So it wouldn't necessarily be an ontological perspective. I mean, I should probably be cautious about saying that. Because it's a process, right? We were born as human beings, but to be truly human is this process of developing virtue, cultivating the self, and only so few people are going to take the time and effort to be able to do that. And so on the other side, if you're practicing vices and your vices become more habitual, you're a menace to your community. It's not so much that you would lose your dignity as a human being, because it's not really a term that the Chinese would have, is this idea of dignity. Mm-hmm. It's more of you're causing social disharmony and something needs to be done with you. From the Confucian perspective, the ideal would be, he talks about using the straight to basically realign the crooked. And so you take somebody who is morally exemplar, mm-hmm. who cannot be bent by bad habits, and in essence you would make them for lack of a better word, the mentor of this individual, or you put them in place of like, okay, look, he needs to be fixed in society, and he has the capability of being fixed in society. All societies, you have people that, for whatever reason, don't have the mental capacity or things like that, and there's not a lot you can do with them, so you just have to deal. But if they do have that mental capacity, you put them to somebody who is morally exemplar, and then potentially they can allow for the process. If they're so far gone, maybe not, and you just have to dish out one of the 5 punishments on them.
So so Confucianism sounds very rehabilitative, but there might be a point where it's just, it's time to end it.
Ideally, I mean, the Confucius accepted that laws are necessary, right, for society to make it flourish and to be harmonious, but if we have a law for everything, then it becomes problematic. People should be virtuous, and you can't legislate people into being virtuous. You have to cultivate them into being virtuous. You have to give them incentive. If you create too many laws, people will just figure out clever ways to get around the laws, and we know that from digital piracy.
Sure. Yeah, but I mean more like, can they be saved in a sense?
Yeah,
Or
and
can their dignity be
they
restored?
can. Well, so again, dignity. I don't know if it's necessarily the term that we use, but they can be brought back into society and be perfect members of society again, depending upon what issues they have caused, what sin against the community they've caused. I'm not really a big fan of using that, but it's colloquial for us.
Right.
So, if you kill your family, probably be a really difficult time for you to come back. Plus, there's the thing of would you even be willing to?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Not necessarily that you would be lost in theory, but would you even be willing to do something like that? And maybe.
Is there any concept of grace? Trying to.
I think that's the zhren, the humanity, the humanness or the benevolence, as you would extend sort of grace. I mean, we do it all the time with children, right? And that, maybe the child is the one that poops in the corner, and we wouldn't be like, that's undignified. You're like, okay, well, you're a child, and so okay, you don't have that.
Right.
And then that would extend outwards to other human beings when it is appropriate, when it is acceptable. Certain things are not acceptable to allow to happen, and you would have to have certain punishments that come along with it, or you'd have certain ways of correcting said behavior. For Confucius, while cultivating virtue is the ideal, a lot of it also becomes contextual about how you reprimand, how you correct, how you guide into a better way. In fact, critics of Confucius Analects will point out, he has a lot of times where it seems almost he's contradictory depending upon which student he's talking to. Apologists will point out, no, he's seeing what that particular student needs in order to be on their path. And so different people are going to require different things, which is kind of exhausting. You can't give, a universal mandate a la Kant for everybody to appeal to in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
But human beings are kind of weird and quirky and,
True.
different.
I
Okay.
think that maybe we can kind of generalize your question a little bit. Perhaps ask the following question.
He doesn't like being sidelined.
It's okay. Continue.
What are the appropriate sort of elements of order so that a society, multiple humans, can live together in relative harmony?
Well, my question is about if someone has zero dignity, assuming that's possible, assuming someone can get to the point where they have zero dignity, can they come back from that? Well, I was specifically asking in the Confucian tradition, which is contrasted with the Christian or the Western tradition, but I'm curious about all traditions, is it possible to perform actions that annihilate, completely eradicate your dignity? And if you do that, is there any path back to dignity?
So if I understand Derek says that in the system he is describing, the word dignity,
It's not a great word.
It doesn't play a role, maybe even there's no word for it or something, but certainly it doesn't function in the same way as we discussed here, but maybe there is a surrogate for it, and the surrogate is a certain concept of virtue.
Mm-hmm.
Dignity, so Derek responded to your question. You can have a situation in which, let's say, somebody violates all the Confucian recipes for making chicken soup. It's like a recipe. Do this. When you're 22 and a half, do this. When you're 17 and a half, you do this. You have to wait 2 years and 2 months before you can do this, and you can do that. So it's kind of a recipe, right? Do it exactly the way I tell you, chicken soup is going to come out. So a virtuous person will come out. And it may be, and to a previous question, I don't remember who, maybe it was yours or somebody else's, when somebody asked you, what about somebody who is, the father that is really evil, and the son tries to say, hey, that you got to look at that kind of an example in the context of the whole society. You can't look at it in isolation. The recipe is good for preserving a level of harmony in the society. It may be a little counterintuitive in this particular example, but if it is held in all the rest of the community, the consequences of how much this particular case can impact the harmony of the whole will not be that bad. But if you start to say, well, there are all of these exceptions. Well, if your father does this and then that, and then you can't have any laws that order it into a harmony. That's my understanding of how.
It seems to me that in Richard's view, you can never lose your intrinsic dignity. That's what makes it intrinsic. So that's going to stay a constant amount. You can never lose that no matter what you do. In Derek's or the Confucian view, you can certainly lose your virtue, but you can also come back from that, although there might be a point of no return where you've become so unvirtuous, you're done. And then it seems in your view, you theoretically could lose your autonomy, or you could have less autonomy, which would seem to imply that you would therefore have less dignity. And so if somebody completely, let's say, committed a series of evil acts and evil acts damage oneself, through your evil acts, you might annihilate your autonomy, and therefore your dignity is gone. But maybe you could get your dignity back if your autonomy could be restored.
I wonder if you're trying to just conflate too many categories there, because when you move from what I was thinking, in terms of intrinsic dignity, to what Derek, and I'll let him speak on behalf of his view, but about the losing virtue. It's like, within the Christian tradition, you can lose virtue, right? So those are two different categories. And so intrinsic dignity doesn't mean everything's okay. I mean, the Christian tradition presupposes there's been a massive rupture relationally, with their creator. And so, and a loss of virtue. And so, I just wonder if you're trying to.
No, I'm not. Yeah, I completely understand that, like in the Christian worldview, your dignity remains constant, but you could certainly be incredibly unvirtuous. So in your worldview, Hitler would have his dignity. He would be a human being.
He's a human being, right?
Yeah, he's a human, but he's obviously incredibly lacking in virtue. I mean, there is a view that C.S. Lewis says something that what gets cast into hell is not a person, but its remains. It's the remains of a person.
Okay.
So at that point you might have zero dignity, but then you would also cease to be human. Could a human become so corrupt they're no longer human? They're so unvirtuous they lose their humanity and therefore their dignity. But that's a different question. But you clearly believe that dignity is a constant. There's nothing I can do. I could poop on the floor right now. I'm going to keep my dignity, my intrinsic dignity.
Yeah.
Right. Obviously I would lose some other kinds of dignity.
Yeah.
But I'm
You'd probably call 911 and have you arrested.
right. Lock me up, put me in the white room. But I think it's interesting on Peter's view, which is a point you've brought out, is that dignity seems to be co-variable with autonomy. You get more autonomy, you get more dignity. You get less autonomy, you get less dignity, and that seems to be a scary view. But I'm also interested in this concept of redemption.
So to me, dignity, you see, to me, the concept of intrinsic dignity as defined by...
We have 3 minutes, by the way.
and defended by Richard has absolutely no use, no value at all in this sense.
But yours seems problematic, though, even though it has value.
It's just like a hanging thing that we pin to the human race and we say, it's there. What does it do? Nothing, but it can be lost.
Well, let me grant that point.
It can be lost. It doesn't do anything.
Okay.
So I'm willing to buy the vulnerabilities, as I said before, that you raise
Yeah.
and that Richard raised before, which makes my theory much more interesting because now we have to actually face challenges and figure out how it works. Whereas according to Richard, it goes like this.
Well, let me.
This group of entities have intrinsic dignity. What else can you say? Nothing.
Well, why can't, let me ask you a question. Why, you're familiar with the position in philosophy of mind called emergentism, which is the idea that the mind just kind of emerges out of the brain when it gets complex enough. And, there's some forms of emergentism that it's just kind of mysterious. Your brain attains a certain level of complexity and boom, you have a mind. Why can't dignity be something similar to that? You have certain features and then, boom, it just emerges out of those features that you get dignity. Like you have an aesthetic sense, you have a moral sense, you have a spiritual sense, you have rationality.
Emergence under what conditions?
Under the conditions that I just listed, rationality, aesthetics, morality.
Hey, you and I are friends. Perfect, no problem.
But why
This is
can't
exactly
that?
my view.
Yeah, but why can't that also
I'm also
be
an emergentist
part
about
of the
the
image
mind.
of God?
Yeah,
Like, why can't you
that's
say?
not his view.
But why can't it be? The image of God
It
could.
can be because he wants the following. Here's what Richard wants. Richard wants that intrinsic dignity is sort of a fundamental feature of all and only those who are human beings. And who are those? Those that were created in the image and likeness of God. So intrinsic dignity is explained by reference to the creation.
Okay, I think what Richard wants, we're not going to ask him what he wants. We're just going to tell him what he wants. I think
I decide what he wants.
I think what Richard wants is to say dignity is a function or emerges out of being made in the image of God. That's what I think he wants. Now that raises a problem of what the hell is the image of God? Forgive my blasphemy. But what exactly is the image of God? But it seems to me he wants to say dignity comes out of, I don't know how else to put it, to say it's an emergent property or a constituent part of being in the image of God. So that's what it seems to me he's saying.
I think he would more like the constituent part than.
Yeah.
Okay, but then why can't the image of God simply be you have a moral sense, you have a rational sense, you have an aesthetic sense, you have a spiritual sense, you have autonomy? Why can't that be what the image of God is?
And that's been the answer given by a number of philosophers, theologians through the history, and that was what we talked about, that resemblance view or the structural view. You have to have a certain, and I think those structural elements are there, but I think it's probably more than that.
Yeah, well, because I've struggled with this concept of the image of God for years, because it always seems when people, like I've heard this argument so many times, like, oh, humans have dignity and value because we're made in the image of God, and then the property or the predicate of the image, being in the image of God, just seems to be completely vague, purely metaphysical, even maybe mystical. It's just this, it's like God's got some special sauce or energy or something that he then puts onto humans, and that gives them value, which chickens don't have.
Except when you go into a church and you can see image of God. It's right there.
True.
Long hair and 2 eyes and all of that, and a beard, of course.
I think we're out of time.
So, if anyone has any final questions, feel free to ask.
We can stay here until we want.
That's true.
We're not.
That's true. We are at the time limit, so I'm going to release you from your bonds here. Thank you very much for coming out. Thank you for having the conversation with us.
Are you kicking them out?
No, I'm not kicking them out.
Okay,
I'm releasing them.
Stay as long as you want to.
I'm releasing.
Leave now while you can.
See, this is confessionism for you. It's 30 minutes after that. We gotta close it down. The recipe.
No. It's not that it's rigidly that. It's that we set a time, and
This is one of the most fundamental. So he helped us get to one of the most cutting-edge issues of this whole debate.
That's fine.
And the cutting-edge issue that he is proposing is this.
However, if anybody, out of their own virtue, is feeling obligated to stay, I am releasing them from that obligation so they may leave.
But I don't.
With good conscience.
They are obligated to stay because no, anybody who wants to leave.
And I suppose we could have a round of applause for the speakers.
Yeah. Thank
you again for coming out today.
For those who are interested in the cutting edge issue here is what is the explanatory force of the role of God regarding all of these central issues that we struggle with?
God has dignity. He made us in his image. Therefore, that dignity transfers to us.
Yeah, but what you said is, can the Richard model
Uh-huh.
that he presents and endorses, can that be can be constructed in such a way that the concept of intrinsic dignity emerges from the other resemblance relations?
Yeah, I mean, could it be combinable with your position? God has value and dignity because he has all these features, morality, rationality, free will, stuff like that. He gives those features to us,
Right,
hence
and
we're made in his
I don't
image.
think so. I think he wants it to be constitutive. In other words,
I'd want to think about that some more. I'd want to think,
Yeah. I mean, because it seems like if that's all it means to be made in the image of God, just to have the properties I just listed, then we could certainly have those without there being a God, or so it seems. I mean, now we're getting into metaphysics.
I mean, look, you're
But
right.
is there something additional? Is there this, like, being made in the image of God might include all those, but there's this special extra something, this extra ingredient we need in order to get dignity? Or can dignity just be a function of morality, aesthetics, spirituality, freedom, etc.? That's the question
And
I
agree
would
with
want.
you. On my view, dignity is an emergent property of autonomy and
Right. But would you agree that on your view, some people have less dignity than others?
yes.
And what do you ground equal treatment in? Like, for example, I mean, I just worked at a prison filled with sex offenders. How much dignity do these men have, and how should we treat them, according to your ethic? According to a Kantian ethic, how should we treat these criminals who have done egregious acts? And yet, for Richard's view, they still have dignity, they still have to be treated according to their fundamental dignity. How should we treat inmates of any stripe, criminals?
Yeah, these are good questions that I embrace these questions.
But do you have answers to the
I have
questions?
some answers to some and not to others.
Okay.
These are very difficult questions, but that's why, and to me, the reason I embrace these questions and challenges is because I consider my theory, therefore, to be very rich. It may be false, but it's at least rich because it has these difficulties.
But you think Richard's position is devoid of questions?
Exactly. There's one statement there.
I think you two need to step out back and settle it like men.
Those
But
who have human, and the essential property of being human, which is essentially genetic code, but let's say something else, have intrinsic dignity.
okay.
What
Yeah,
else
well,
can you say? It can't be lost.
but his
Because
position
it
isn't
can-
so
or it can be
vacuous
lost only
because he
if that
talks
other
about the image of
property is lost.
God. His position isn't completely vacuous. He talks about the image
What
of
problems
God.
does it have?
Yeah, What properties does what have? Dignity or the image of God?
What problems will Richard have to face?
Well, the problem he has to face is defining the image of God and then explaining how that creates dignity. Like how, I mean,
It doesn't. I believe that he does not have the privilege.
So, I mean, one issue we might be able to raise with Richard's point, dignity, is what does it compel us to do? At least from Peter's perspective on autonomy, right? Autonomy has certain sort of obligations that come along with it. You are compelled by their very nature to behave in a particular way. With dignity, I don't know, it might just be a passive thing, or we might have to ask, okay,
well, I actually
you
think
have dignity, so
there's
now
an
what?
answer to that. I'm sorry, there's an answer, and I'll let Richard speak, but I'm going to give my Richard answer before Richard gives his Richard answer. So my Richard answer is that being made in the image of God is explicitly connected with being a steward over the earth. So it does come with responsibilities. God is a ruler. He creates, what's a great word? Like a viceroy is a great word. We're ambassadors. We're viceroys. We're stewards.
Vice-regent.
Yeah, vice-regent. There you go. That's a good word. We're like the vice-regents of God. We speak in his name. We act on his behalf. That's our task. So being made in the image of God does come with a responsibility because we have to have authority and treat correctly the earth. We have to treat correctly the creation. God kind of rules through us, in a sense.
That's exactly, and that's exactly right. And that's why a number of theologians, philosophers, more recently over the last couple centuries, have moved away from that structural approach to the image, trying to list out the properties, but rather looking at it as, no, precisely what you said in terms of how we rule and reign. You'd be fruitful and multiply. You're given a task, and that is to properly, they almost use the word image as a verb. You need to image God.
I kind of like that. Yeah, I mean, you
And
need
so
to.
now to be able to do that, you have to have certain structural capabilities, right?
Sure.
It's not that a turtle can do that, right?
Right.
And so we're going to find that in order to, that presupposed in being able to do what God wants us to do as stewards, to image him verbal, the verb sense, to image me in relationality is going to require, certain, you're going to require, a certain kind of reason and a certain.
Yeah, it would seem like power and wisdom would be two things that I would.
Right.
I'm hesitant to use rationality because I don't want to Greekify an ancient Hebrew text. I'm
Sure.
a little hesitant. Well, I think the West.
You have an idea of rationality at all?
Of course, I'm not saying that. Well, again, ancient, just like,
Building, I don't know.
look, we've just shown that Confucians have a different framework and don't have some of our concepts, right?
Your Richard. With your Richard. is this.
My Richard view, I like this.
Explanatory work is done by what goes into image and likeness.
But what's wrong with that?
And then dignity just flows out of that as a dangling property that doesn't explain anything.
Okay, but how does dignity, I mean, you can list autonomy, but I don't know if you really quite explained the link between autonomy and dignity.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like, okay, Richard says image and then he gets dignity, and you're like, well, there's an explanatory gap, but why isn't there just an explanatory gap anyway? I mean, this almost sounds like the good old is-ought problem.
Well, so Peter's not arguing for dignity. He's saying that autonomy is something that is deeper than dignity, and so dignity doesn't really mean anything for him. So you're right. He's not arguing for it. He's just tossed it out. It's not a.
Well, he's saying that dignity is
The
an.
concept of dignity involves the concept of respect, self-respect, and respecting others.
Sure.
And the whole concept of respect is based on the idea of self-determination, the way I understand it in a Kantian flavor. And self-determination is the idea that it's not just anything goes, just because the word self is there doesn't mean anything goes. Oh, it just depends on me. No, it depends on what kind of resources you bring to bear in order to create a unified self.
Okay.
And there, not anything goes. And because you are aiming to create a unified, harmonious self, you need to have respect to every element of who you are, the body, the mind,
Sure.
and so on. So dignity flows out of the concept of a unified self, self-respect, dignity.
Okay. Why, in 100 words or less, why is grounding dignity in autonomy superior to grounding dignity in the image of God? If the image of God is everything we've just said it is. Yes, you.
If you were to ask me what image and likeness mean in that context, I can tell you the only information we have is what God is prior to that section, to that particular passage, namely, law creator. So image and likeness means that we were created in God's image and likeness insofar as we can identify, discover, and create laws.
You have 60 words left.
Therefore, autonomy. So in this reading, I'm willing to adopt the image and likeness model, but
Okay.
only if image and likeness means law creator have to do with whatever enters into creating and discovering laws, which means reason. And if you interpret it that way, I am absolutely fine. With the exception, one real exception is that I am have little problems with the question of how God created us exactly.
Sure.
Putting that aside, you want to find a structural similarity between the two views. The structural similarity will be that.
Okay.
But as long as he interprets image and likeness in another way, then we depart completely.
Would all three of you agree that dignity is grounded in something more basic?
That what?
That would all three of you agree, in your respective traditions, that dignity is grounded in something more basic? It has to be grounded in something. Would all three of you agree with that? Professor Ayala, would you agree with that?
I mean, again, like, I don't know that's necessarily a concept that would matter in the same way, other than like, okay, you're a human being, and so you, like, there are certain things that come with that. Right, you're a human being, right. Although within the Confucian tradition, Confucius, and actually more importantly, like Mencius later, like a human is humane, and they play on the Chinese terminology to make a pun of it. It seems like a tautology, but it's not quite. It's really not so much like, do you have dignity, it's like, how upstanding of a human being are you?
Yeah, I know we keep using this term dignity in a Confucian context, which makes no sense exactly. But it seems like all three of you are saying that human dignity is grounded in human nature. You just have different views about human nature. It's all, human nature is something special and unique, and that's what creates dignity.
I don't like the word human nature in this general way. What I say is it's grounded in some other concepts that are related to who we are, and therefore I think I take it to be the autonomy.
It's grounded in being a person with autonomy, okay, which is part of human nature, and then it's grounded in being a human, which means you have the capability of being virtuous, or it's grounded in being made in the image of God.
Right.
My problem with the phrase human nature is that it suggests something completely fixed.
Okay.
Like fixed. I think there are some parts of who we are that are fixed. Like, for example, we need oxygen in order to live. That's
Sure.
fixed.
Right.
You know, but when it comes to these other areas,
Why would it have to be fixed? And why?
human nature,
Yeah. Why automatically assume that it would have to be fixed,
No.
and or that it would be problematic if certain elements of it were fixed, right? So if we say that, and a feature of human nature is the ability to have reflection, which is something that I think you appeal to, or appeals
Very
to
much so.
you. I mean, if that is a fixed quality of being human, is that an issue?
but here's my problem. We are capable of self-reflection, but then there are some that are totally incapable of it,
Mm-hmm.
and
I have
others
family
that are
members.
too much of it. And then there's all in between. So when you say self-reflection is part of human nature, you assume that, okay, everybody is doing the same kind of thing, self-reflect, and everybody is doing that. No.
Well, does it have to be
But
to?
it's true that we are capable
Right.
of self-reflection.
Does it have to be to a philosophical level, or can you self-reflect on just the day that you had?
Yeah, not necessarily.
So, like, it could theoretically be in degrees. In
Oh,
that
yeah,
sense.
that's the point. Including zero.
Mhm.
I know some that it's about close to zero.
Well, I mean, yeah, even in like a basic idea, right? There are prisoners that have no ability to self-reflect. They just lack the capability to do it.
I don't know whether they do. Some do and some don't, most likely.
Right. There's some that have literally zero empathy. Like, okay, what do you think this person felt? I don't know. I'm not them. Like,
Yeah.
that raises some really interesting questions about,
Right.
you know, what do we do with those members of society? But
It sounds to me like we're grounding dignity in virtue in one way or the other, and we're grounding virtue in being a person. Would that be a somewhat fair statement?
I mean, from the Confucian perspective, sure.
Okay. But even from like, you know, or the fact that we're moral beings, or is that somewhat accurate? That we're grounding?
I think that, yes.
Because the title of this talk was Human Nature and Dignity, and it's
What
some
does
sort
it
of
mean
like,
to be human?
and it means to have dignity, but our dignity is grounded in our human nature.
This is important with the moral agency. It's a very central concept in my view, which is of course also distinguishes like the whole story of the fall and it's all
Well, it's okay. So human nature.
it's all imposed on the Adam and Eve story. In fact, the Adam and Eve story is not about original sin or about the fall. It is actually the opposite. It's about a story about the ascent of humanity to moral agency. And I have a proof of that.
That's interesting. That's an interesting view.
It's impossible, according to the way the story is, for there to be an original sin prior to eating from the tree.
Yes, I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
Not possible.
I-
Therefore,
yeah.
the story has to be about something else rather than the original sin which creates a huge rupture between humans and God, and therefore we need some very special divine intervention to bring it back together, namely Jesus.
And which rabbinical tradition did you get that from?
When this was presented to a rabbi, then that's the question he asked.
For,
The answer was, oh, I don't think it belongs to any rabbinical tradition.
for the people in the audience, I'd like to give a tentative definition of human nature and dignity, which is what this talk was about. I would say.
I think we've been doing that. I mean, I'm not sure how much more you want to go till.
I oppose the demand for definitions, because you can have stipulative definitions, which is for a certain purpose,
Sure.
or you can have definitions that track the nature of things, and that's a whole different story. That's what we're trying to do. What is the concept here?
Well, thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you for the question. Very good, very stimulating discussion. Richard, she left, so we have to take all the stuff.
Oh, yeah.